The evening of my 32nd birthday began like any other celebration I had organized over the years, with the familiar faces of friends gathering at my favorite downtown restaurant, the clinking of glasses, and the warm glow of candlelight reflecting off the exposed brick walls that gave the venue its characteristic charm. I had spent weeks planning this event, coordinating schedules, making reservations, and ensuring that everyone who mattered to me would be present for what I hoped would be a memorable night. The restaurant, a converted warehouse space with soaring ceilings and industrial fixtures, softened by strategically placed greenery and ambient lighting, had always felt like a second home to me, a place where countless memories had been forged over shared meals and late-night conversations. As I arrived that evening, dressed in my best jacket and feeling the particular kind of anticipation that birthdays always brought, I had no idea that the next few hours would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life in ways I could never have anticipated. My closest friends had already claimed a long table near the back of the restaurant, their laughter cutting through the ambient noise of the busy Friday night crowd, and seeing them there, raising their glasses in my direction as I approached, filled me with a profound sense of gratitude and belonging. There was Marcus, my college roommate, who had become more like a brother over the years, his wife Elena beside him with her characteristic warm smile, and next to them sat David and James, friends from my early career days who had witnessed my professional struggles and triumphs with equal measures of support and good-natured ribbing. The table was already crowded with appetizers and drinks, and as I took my seat at the head, I felt enveloped by the comfortable familiarity of people who knew me deeply and accepted me completely. The conversation flowed easily, touching on work updates, vacation plans, and the inevitable reminiscing about past birthdays and the misadventures they had contained. I was in the middle of recounting a particularly embarrassing story from my 25th birthday when I first noticed her, standing at the entrance of the restaurant with a confidence that seemed to create its own spotlight. She was with a group I did not immediately recognize, friends of friends perhaps, but she stood out immediately in a way that transcended mere physical beauty. Her dark hair fell in carefully arranged waves past her shoulders, and she wore a deep red dress that complemented her olive complexion perfectly. But it was something else entirely that captured my attention, a certain magnetism in the way she carried herself, the slight upturn of her lips that suggested she knew secrets worth discovering, and the way her eyes swept across the room as if cataloging everyone present and finding them wanting. I felt my breath catch as her gaze briefly met mine, and in that moment, something shifted in my chest, a tectonic movement of feeling that I would later recognize as the first tremor of an emotional earthquake. Marcus noticed my distraction and followed my gaze, letting out a low whistle that earned him a playful slap on the arm from Elena. He leaned over and informed me that the woman was apparently a recent addition to our extended social circle, a friend of a coworker's girlfriend, and that she had been invited by someone at another table, but had ended up joining our group's general celebration area. I nodded absently, trying to return my attention to the conversation at hand, but finding my eyes continually drawn back to where she now stood at the bar, ordering a drink with the casual authority of someone who expected to be served immediately. As the evening progressed, fate, or perhaps careful orchestration on her part, seemed to conspire to bring us closer together. She drifted toward our table during a lull in conversations with her own group, ostensibly to wish me a happy birthday after learning from mutual acquaintances that this gathering was in my honor. Her voice was low and melodic when she introduced herself as Victoria, and when she said my name back to me, it sounded different somehow, as if she was claiming it for herself. We talked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and I found myself utterly captivated by her wit, her intelligence, and the way she seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. She asked questions about my work, my passions, my dreams, and her attention felt like sunshine after a long winter, warming parts of me I had not realized were cold. Looking back now with the clarity of hindsight, I can identify this moment as the first sign I should have recognized, the first red flag waving urgently in my peripheral vision that I chose to ignore. Her interest was too intense, too focused, too perfectly calibrated to make me feel special and chosen. Narcissistic individuals often begin their relationships with what psychologists call love bombing, an overwhelming campaign of attention, affection, and apparent devotion designed to quickly establish emotional dependency in their targets. But in that moment, surrounded by friends, buoyed by birthday euphoria, and intoxicated by her presence, I mistook manipulation for connection, strategy for spontaneity, and the opening move of an elaborate game for genuine attraction. The restaurant seemed to fade around us as we talked, the noise and movement becoming a distant backdrop to what felt like a private universe of two. She touched my arm lightly when she laughed at my jokes, leaned in close enough for me to catch her perfume, something expensive and intoxicating, and maintained eye contact with an intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person she had ever encountered. By the time my friends began gathering their things to leave, I had already given her my number, already agreed to meet for coffee later that week, already begun constructing elaborate fantasies about our future together. As I said my goodbyes to the friends who had come to celebrate my birthday, I barely registered their knowing smiles and raised eyebrows. Marcus pulled me aside before leaving, his expression carrying a hint of concern beneath the teasing. He mentioned that he had heard things about Victoria, nothing specific, just a general sense that she had left a trail of complicated relationships in her wake, that she was the kind of person who burned brightly but left scorched earth behind. I dismissed his concerns with the easy confidence of someone who believed himself immune to such warnings, convinced that whatever difficulties others had experienced were surely their own failings, that I was different, special, capable of seeing the real Victoria beneath whatever protective armor she might wear. This dismissal of a concerned friend's warning was perhaps the second sign I failed to recognize, the pattern of isolation that narcissistic partners often encourage, the subtle undermining of other relationships that would eventually leave me alone and dependent on her approval. But that night, walking home through streets slicked with recent rain, the city lights reflecting in puddles like scattered stars, I felt only the electric anticipation of new romance, the delicious uncertainty of beginnings, and the heady conviction that my 32nd year would be the year everything changed. I could not have known how right I was, though not in any of the ways I imagined. The night air was cool against my flushed cheeks as I replayed our conversation in my mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, every shared glance for evidence of reciprocated feeling. Sleep came late that night, and when it finally arrived, it was filled with dreams of dark hair and knowing smiles, of whispered promises, and the intoxicating possibility of being truly seen and chosen by someone extraordinary. Our first official date arrived 3 days after my birthday, 3 days during which Victoria had texted me almost constantly, her messages arriving with a frequency and intensity that I mistook for enthusiasm rather than recognizing as the calculated strategy it truly was. Each morning began with a good morning text that referenced something specific from our previous conversation, demonstrating what seemed like genuine attention and care, but what I now understand was careful note-taking and intentional recall designed to make me feel uniquely understood. Throughout each day, she would share articles she thought I would find interesting, songs that reminded her of things I had said, photographs of places she wanted to show me someday, each message another thread in the web she was weaving around my heart. By the time I walked into the coffee shop where we had agreed to meet, I already felt as if I had known her for months rather than mere days, a sense of accelerated intimacy that should have been my first clear warning, but instead felt like confirmation of a special connection. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee already ordered, explaining that she had taken the liberty of guessing my preference based on things I had mentioned during our birthday conversation. The fact that she had guessed correctly, down to the specific type of milk and the absence of sugar, struck me as almost magical, evidence of a rare understanding rather than careful information gathering. We talked for hours that first date, the coffee growing cold and forgotten as we leaned across the table toward each other, sharing stories and dreams with an openness that felt both exhilarating and slightly dangerous. Victoria was a masterful conversationalist, knowing exactly when to ask probing questions and when to offer revelations of her own, creating a rhythm of exchange that felt perfectly balanced, even though I now recognize I was sharing far more than she ever did. She spoke of her childhood in vague but emotionally resonant terms, suggesting depths of pain and complexity that invited my protective instincts, hinting at wounds that only someone special could help heal. This was another classic technique I failed to recognize, the strategic vulnerability that narcissistic individuals deploy to create emotional investment in their targets, the carefully curated glimpses of damage that make us feel chosen and capable of being the one who finally understands. I left that first date floating on a cloud of infatuation, already planning our next meeting, already imagining the future we might build together. The following weeks blurred into a montage of romantic gestures and intense connection that I had never before experienced. Victoria seemed to anticipate my needs before I expressed them, appearing at my office with lunch when I mentioned being too busy to eat, sending flowers after I had a difficult day at work, planning elaborate surprises that demonstrated intimate knowledge of my tastes and preferences. She introduced me to her favorite restaurants, her secret spots around the city, her carefully curated world of beauty and sophistication that made my previous existence seem mundane in comparison. When we were together, her attention was absolute and unwavering, her focus on me so complete that the rest of the world seemed to disappear. She remembered every detail I shared, referenced previous conversations with precision, and made me feel like the most fascinating person she had ever encountered. The intensity of her attention was intoxicating, creating a feedback loop of validation that quickly became addictive. I found myself craving her presence, checking my phone constantly for her messages, restructuring my days around the possibility of seeing her. Friends began to comment on my distraction, my absence from gatherings I would normally attend, my tendency to redirect every conversation back to Victoria. I dismissed their observations as the natural adjustment period of new love, unable to see how quickly my world was contracting to revolve around a single sun. The love-bombing phase of a relationship with a narcissist is designed to create exactly this kind of dependency, to establish a baseline of intense, positive regard against which all future behavior will be measured. By flooding me with affection, attention, and apparent understanding, Victoria was setting the stage for the manipulation to come, creating an emotional debt I would spend months trying to repay. But in those early weeks, I saw only the fairy tale unfolding before me, the finale of meeting someone who truly understood me, the relief of being chosen by someone so obviously special. One evening, about 3 weeks into our relationship, Victoria made a comment that should have registered as significant, but instead slipped past my defenses disguised as flattery. We were walking through a park near her apartment, hands intertwined, the last light of day painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She stopped suddenly, turning to face me with an expression of intense sincerity, and told me that she had never felt this way about anyone before, that I was different from everyone she had ever dated, that she knew from the moment she saw me that I was the one who would finally understand her. The words themselves were not unusual for new lovers to exchange, but something in her delivery struck an odd note, a performative quality that suggested she was reciting lines she had spoken before, perhaps many times before. I pushed the thought away immediately, chiding myself for my cynicism, for allowing past disappointments to poison present joy. But that flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed, was the part of me that recognized the truth even when I refused to consciously acknowledge it. Victoria's declarations of unique connection were not genuine revelations, but rather calculated moves designed to accelerate intimacy and establish the narrative of our special, unprecedented bond. This technique serves multiple purposes for the narcissistic individual. It creates a sense of obligation in the target, who now feels responsible for living up to this special status. It isolates the relationship from external evaluation by framing it as something others could not possibly understand. And it establishes early that the narcissist's feelings are deeper and more significant than ordinary emotions, setting the stage for later claims that any problems in the relationship must be the fault of the partner who failed to appreciate what was being offered. I spent that night at Victoria's apartment for the first time, and as I lay awake listening to her breathe beside me, I felt a complicated mix of happiness and unease that I attributed to the vulnerability of new intimacy. The apartment itself seemed to reflect something of her nature that I was not yet ready to acknowledge, decorated with impeccable taste, but somehow lacking warmth, filled with beautiful objects that seemed chosen for display rather than meaning, photographs featuring only Victoria herself rather than friends or family. The space was a carefully curated environment, a stage set designed to project an image rather than reveal a person. But I noticed these things only peripherally, my attention consumed by the woman sleeping beside me and the future I was already constructing in my imagination. The love bombing continued for another month, each day bringing new demonstrations of devotion, new ways in which Victoria proved herself to be the perfect partner I had always sought. She remembered my mother's birthday and helped me choose a gift. She supported my work ambitions with enthusiastic encouragement. She seemed to align with my values and desires in ways that felt almost too good to be true. And of course, they were too good to be true, a carefully constructed facade designed to secure my emotional investment before the real relationship could begin. The shift came so gradually that I almost missed it. The way winter arrives not in a single dramatic snowfall, but in a slow accumulation of cold days that eventually transform the landscape entirely. It began approximately 6 weeks into our relationship, during a dinner party at Marcus and Elena's home, where Victoria and I made our first official appearance as a couple among my oldest friends. The evening started well enough, with Victoria charming the room as I had seen her do so many times before, but as the night progressed, I began to notice something different in her demeanor. When Elena complimented a story I told about a recent work achievement, Victoria's response carried a new edge, a subtle eye roll, and a comment about how I always exaggerated my accomplishments when I had been drinking. The remark was delivered with a laugh, framed as affectionate teasing, but something in her tone made the words land like small stones. I felt myself deflate slightly, my pride in the achievement suddenly seeming childish and embarrassing. When I caught Marcus watching us with a furrowed brow, I quickly changed the subject, dismissing the moment as insignificant, just the kind of gentle ribbing that couples exchanged. But the comments continued throughout the evening, each one wrapped in enough humor or apparent affection to maintain plausible deniability, yet each one leaving me feeling slightly smaller than before. She mentioned my tendency to monopolize conversations, my questionable taste in music, my habit of laughing too loudly at my own jokes, observations that might have been harmless from someone else, but felt pointed coming from the woman whose opinion had come to matter more than anyone else's. By the end of the evening, I found myself monitoring my behavior carefully, second-guessing every word before I spoke, trying to avoid giving Victoria any reason to find fault. On the drive home, I brought up her comments hesitantly, trying to express that some of them had felt hurtful. Victoria's response was immediate and disorienting, a masterclass in the deflection techniques that narcissistic individuals deploy when confronted with their behavior. She expressed hurt and confusion at my interpretation, insisting that she had only been joking, that she thought couples were supposed to tease each other, that she had not realized I was so sensitive. Within minutes, the conversation had somehow shifted from my hurt feelings to her distress at being misunderstood, her worry that I did not appreciate her sense of humor, her concern that our relationship might not survive if I could not accept her as she was. I found myself apologizing, comforting her, reassuring her that of course I understood, that I had overreacted, that everything was fine. This pattern would repeat countless times over the following months, each instance of devaluation followed by a response that left me doubting my own perceptions and apologizing for having them. The technique is called gaslighting, and it is one of the most insidious tools in the narcissist's arsenal, gradually eroding the victim's trust in their own judgment until they become completely dependent on the narcissist's version of reality. The isolation began around the same time, so subtly that I did not recognize it as a deliberate strategy until much later. Victoria never explicitly told me to stop seeing my friends, never issued ultimatums or demands that would have triggered my resistance. Instead, she employed a softer approach, expressing slight disappointment when I made plans without her, suggesting that she had hoped we would spend that time together, mentioning that she felt left out when I shared experiences with others first. She would point out minor flaws in my friends that I had never noticed before, observations that planted seeds of doubt about the people I had trusted for years. Marcus was suggested to be secretly competitive with me. Elena apparently looked at me in ways that made Victoria uncomfortable. David and James were characterized as immature influences who brought out a side of me that was beneath my potential. Each comment was delivered with apparent concern for my well-being, framed as her desire to see me surrounded by people who truly appreciated me. And slowly, insidiously, I began to see my friendships through Victoria's critical lens, began to feel uncomfortable in the relationships that had once been my foundation. I started declining invitations, making excuses, allowing distances to grow where closeness had once existed. My phone calls to family became less frequent, my texts to friends more sporadic, my world gradually contracting until Victoria stood at its center and everyone else existed only at its margins. The third sign emerged from this isolation, manifesting in Victoria's response to any attention I received from others, particularly other women. What had initially seemed like flattering jealousy quickly revealed itself as something more controlling and volatile. A female colleague mentioned in passing conversation that I had done excellent work on a project, and Victoria's response was hours of cold silence, followed by accusations that I was encouraging inappropriate attention. When a waitress smiled too warmly while serving our table, Victoria's mood would darken for the rest of the evening, requiring extensive reassurance and demonstration of devotion before she would return to her normal demeanor. I learned to avoid eye contact with other women, to redirect conversations away from any topic that might suggest connections or friendships outside our relationship, to preemptively soothe anxieties I had not caused, but for which I felt increasingly responsible. The jealousy was not limited to romantic threats, but extended to anything that claimed my attention or energy. When I became absorbed in a work project, Victoria expressed feeling neglected and unimportant. When I wanted to spend time on personal hobbies, she framed it as a choice against the relationship. Even time spent with family became a source of tension, with Victoria suggesting that my devotion to relatives demonstrated a lack of commitment to building our own future together. I twisted myself into increasingly uncomfortable shapes trying to meet her needs, never quite succeeding, always falling short of some standard that seemed to shift whenever I approached it. The person I had been before Victoria was disappearing, replaced by someone whose primary function was managing her emotional state and avoiding the punishment of her withdrawal. Looking back, I can trace the trajectory of these changes with painful clarity, watching myself transform from a confident individual with a rich network of relationships into an anxious, isolated figure whose self-worth had become entirely contingent on the approval of someone who had a vested interest in withholding it. The devaluation and isolation worked together as complementary strategies, each reinforcing the other. The more my self-esteem eroded under the weight of her criticism, the more I clung to the relationship as my primary source of validation. The more isolated I became from friends and family who might have offered alternative perspectives, the more dependent I became on Victoria's version of reality. I was caught in a trap I had helped construct, my own emotional investments used against me, my desire for love weaponized to ensure my compliance. The woman who had once made me feel chosen and special now made me feel inadequate and grateful, perpetually striving to recapture the magic of those early weeks, while never quite understanding why it remained so elusive. By the fourth month of our relationship, I had become intimately familiar with a pattern I could not name, but whose rhythm governed my emotional existence with the regularity of tides. There were periods of warmth and connection that recalled the early days of our romance, times when Victoria seemed to rediscover her appreciation for me, and our relationship would bask in renewed affection. During these phases, I would feel the relief of a prisoner granted temporary parole, savoring the sweetness of her attention while simultaneously dreading its inevitable withdrawal. Then, triggered by offenses I often could not identify, the coldness would return, and I would find myself cast out from her favor into a wilderness of silence, criticism, and emotional distance. The shift between these states was never gradual but always sudden, leaving me disoriented and desperate to understand what I had done wrong, frantic to repair whatever damage had been caused. This cycle of idealization and devaluation is characteristic of narcissistic relationships, a deliberate mechanism of control that keeps the partner perpetually off balance, forever chasing the approval that is granted only often enough to maintain hope, but never consistently enough to provide security. One particularly vivid instance of this pattern occurred during a weekend trip we had planned to celebrate our 4-month anniversary. Victoria had been distant for several days leading up to our departure, responding to my attempts at conversation with monosyllables, declining physical affection with claims of tiredness or headaches, leaving me in an agony of uncertainty about what I had done to displease her. I had spent hours reviewing our recent interactions, searching for the mistake I must have made, the boundary I must have crossed, convinced that if I could only identify my error, I could fix it and restore our connection. The morning we left for our trip, however, Victoria seemed transformed, greeting me with enthusiasm and warmth that felt almost disorienting after days of coldness. She was affectionate and attentive throughout the drive, full of plans and excitement for the weekend ahead, and I felt the familiar flood of relief that came with her return to favor. We checked into a charming bed and breakfast in a coastal town she had chosen, and the first evening seemed like a return to our early days together, full of easy conversation, shared laughter, and the particular intimacy of discovering a new place with someone you love. I went to sleep that night feeling genuinely happy for the first time in weeks, believing that whatever storm had passed had left us stronger, that we had weathered a difficult period and emerged on the other side. The following morning, everything changed again. Over breakfast, I mentioned that I wanted to call my mother to wish her well, as she had been dealing with some health concerns. Victoria's response was immediate and chilling, her warmth evaporating in an instant as she accused me of prioritizing my family over our anniversary celebration, of proving once again that she would always come second in my life. The argument that followed was intense and disorienting, with Victoria raising grievances I had thought long resolved, cataloguing failures and disappointments I had believed forgiven, painting a picture of our relationship in which I was consistently inadequate and she was perpetually suffering my inadequacy. I found myself apologizing profusely, abandoning the phone call I had planned, promising to do better, to be more present, to prove my commitment in whatever way she required. The rest of the weekend oscillated between periods of tense silence and tentative reconciliation, each thaw followed by another freeze triggered by offenses I could not predict or prevent. By the time we returned home, I was emotionally exhausted, grateful simply to have survived the weekend without a complete breakdown of our relationship. The pattern continued to intensify over the following weeks, the cycles becoming shorter and more severe, the periods of warmth briefer and more conditional. I developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to Victoria's moods, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated which version of her I would be dealing with at any given moment. A certain set to her jaw, a particular tone in her voice, the angle of her shoulders as she moved through a room, all became data points I analyzed constantly, adjusting my behavior in real time to avoid triggering her displeasure. I became skilled at the art of emotional management, anticipating her needs before she expressed them, deflecting potential sources of conflict before they could develop, making myself smaller and more accommodating in the hope of maintaining peace. The person I had been, the person my friends had known and valued, was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt to serve Victoria's requirements. What I did not understand then, but have since learned, is that this cycle serves a specific function for the narcissistic individual. The intermittent reinforcement of affection followed by withdrawal creates a powerful psychological bond, similar to the mechanism that makes gambling so addictive. The unpredictability of reward keeps the partner constantly engaged, constantly striving, constantly hoping that this time they will succeed in earning lasting approval. The highs of the good periods feel higher because they follow the lows of rejection, and the relief of reconnection becomes confused with the excitement of love. Meanwhile, the partner becomes increasingly invested in the relationship precisely because of the effort they have expended trying to make it work. A phenomenon psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something simply because of what has already been invested. I was caught in this trap completely, unable to see the pattern clearly even as I lived within its constraints, convinced that if I just tried harder, loved better, gave more, I could somehow transform our relationship into the paradise of those early weeks. The fourth sign was thus not a single incident, but an ongoing dynamic, a way of relating that gradually normalized dysfunction and made genuine connection impossible. Victoria held all the power in our relationship because she controlled access to the approval I had come to crave, dispensing it strategically to maintain my engagement while withholding it sufficiently to prevent me from ever feeling secure. I had become addicted to a relationship that was systematically harming me, unable to break free because the very mechanisms of my bondage were designed to feel like love. Six months into my relationship with Victoria, I barely recognized the person I had become. The transformation had been so gradual, so incremental, that I had not noticed myself disappearing until I caught a glimpse of my reflection in unexpected contexts and saw a stranger looking back. My friends, the few who remained in regular contact despite my increasing withdrawal, commented on changes they observed with growing concern. I had lost weight without trying, my appetite diminished by the constant stress of managing Victoria's emotional states. My sleep had become erratic, disturbed by anxiety about mistakes I might have made and punishments I might face. The work that had once engaged and fulfilled me now felt like merely another arena in which I was failing to meet expectations, my concentration scattered by the mental energy required to maintain my primary relationship. I had given up hobbies and interests that Victoria had deemed unworthy of my time, stopped expressing opinions that might conflict with hers, adopted her preferences and perspectives until I could no longer remember what my own had been. The fifth sign of a narcissistic partner is perhaps the most devastating: the way they use the relationship as a mirror that reflects only themselves, gradually erasing the separate identity of their partner until only an extension of the narcissist remains. Victoria was not interested in me as an individual with my own thoughts, feelings, and desires. She was interested in me as an audience for her performance, a validator of her self-image, a supporting character in the drama of her life. When I expressed perspectives that differed from hers, she did not engage with them as valid viewpoints worthy of consideration, but rather treated them as problems to be corrected, evidence of my failure to properly understand and appreciate her. Over time, I learned that the path of least resistance was agreement, that maintaining harmony required abandoning any claim to a separate self. The process of erasure happened in countless small moments that accumulated into a complete transformation. Victoria would describe events I had witnessed differently than I remembered them, and when I pointed out the discrepancy, she would respond with such conviction that I began to doubt my own memory. She would attribute motivations to my actions that did not match my internal experience, and her interpretations gradually replaced my own understanding of myself. She would tell me who I was, how I felt, what I wanted, and her certainty was so absolute that my contrary knowledge seemed insubstantial in comparison. I began to experience a strange dissociation from my own emotions, uncertain whether what I felt was real or merely what Victoria had told me I felt. The psychological term for this is identity erosion, and it is a common consequence of prolonged narcissistic abuse. The victim's sense of self becomes so entangled with the narcissist's projections that separating authentic feeling from implanted belief becomes nearly impossible. I remember a particular evening when this process became momentarily visible to me, though I lacked the framework to understand what I was seeing. Victoria and I were attending a gallery opening for an artist she admired, and I had made the mistake of expressing a genuine reaction to one of the pieces, an observation about the work that did not align with Victoria's interpretation. Her response was swift and devastating, a public correction delivered with a condescending smile that made me feel foolish and small in front of the surrounding strangers. For a moment, I felt a flash of authentic anger, a recognition that my perspective was valid and that her dismissal was unjust. But the anger lasted only seconds before being swamped by familiar anxiety, the automatic fear of her displeasure overriding any impulse towards self-defense. I apologized, agreed that I had not properly understood the artist's intention, and spent the rest of the evening performing enthusiasm I did not feel for interpretations I did not share. Later that night, lying awake while Victoria slept, I tried to remember the last time I had expressed a genuine opinion without first calculating whether it would meet with her approval. I could not identify such a moment. I had become so practiced at anticipating and accommodating her preferences that I no longer knew where she ended and I began. This realization should have been a turning point, a moment of clarity that propelled me toward escape. Instead, it triggered only despair and a deeper sense of helplessness. If I no longer existed as a separate person, how could I possibly leave? What would remain if I removed myself from the relationship that had become my entire identity? The narcissist's control is most complete when the victim cannot imagine existence outside the relationship, when the self that might choose freedom has been so thoroughly subsumed that no independent agent remains to make the choice. I was approaching this total absorption, my original personality persisting only in fragments that surfaced occasionally before being quickly suppressed. The friends who still called occasionally seemed to be speaking to a ghost, addressing someone who no longer lived in the body that answered their inquiries. I could hear their confusion and concern through the phone line, could recognize that their responses did not match the person I was presenting, but I could not bridge the gap between who I had been and who I had become. Victoria, for her part, seemed pleased with my transformation, praising me for finally learning to be a good partner, expressing satisfaction with my growth and development under her guidance. Her approval felt good even as some buried part of me recognized it as evidence of my erasure rather than my improvement. The fifth sign was thus the near-complete loss of self that narcissistic relationships ultimately produce, the replacement of an authentic individual with a hollow echo designed to reflect the narcissist's glory. I had become exactly what Victoria wanted, a mirror that showed only her, a supporting actor with no inner life beyond service to her narrative, a shell of a person whose only purpose was validating her existence. The breaking point came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet moment of exhausted clarity that I will remember for the rest of my life. We were in Victoria's apartment, 8 months into our relationship, and she was berating me for a transgression I could not understand, my failure to respond to a text message quickly enough, or perhaps my tone of voice during dinner, or maybe something else entirely that I had already forgotten in the overwhelming blur of her displeasure. I stood in her kitchen, receiving her criticism with the familiar posture of submission I had learned to adopt, my eyes down, my responses apologetic, my entire being contracted into the smallest possible target. And then, without warning or conscious decision, something shifted. It was as if I had been watching our interaction from outside my body, seeing for the first time the full picture of what I had become. The man standing there, flinching at words, apologizing for crimes he did not commit, twisting himself into impossible shapes to satisfy someone who would never be satisfied. That man was so far from the person I had been on my birthday night that the distance seemed unbridgeable. I thought of Marcus's warning that first evening, the concern I had dismissed so easily, and I understood finally what he had seen that I had refused to see. I thought of all the friends I had neglected, the family I had abandoned, the work I had sabotaged, the self I had surrendered, all in service to a love that had never been love at all. The sixth sign, the final piece of the pattern I had been too close to perceive, was the stark recognition of the comprehensive damage that the relationship had inflicted. I looked at Victoria, still speaking, her beautiful face animated with the particular energy that criticism seemed to give her, and I felt something I had not experienced in months. A clear, uncomplicated emotion that belonged entirely to me. It was not anger, though anger would come later. It was not even sadness, though sadness would follow me for years. It was simply certainty, a bone-deep knowledge that I could not survive much longer in this relationship, that the choice before me was between escape and complete annihilation. I do not remember exactly what I said, only that I interrupted her mid-sentence, which I had never done before. I told her I was leaving, that the relationship was over, that I would not be discussing it further. Her response cycled through the strategies I now recognized. First confusion, then tears, then anger, then promises of change, then threats about what she would tell others about me, then back to tears. Each tactic that had previously been effective at keeping me in place now seemed transparent, almost mechanical, a programmed sequence rather than genuine human response. I left her apartment that night with nothing but my keys and wallet, and I did not return. The weeks and months that followed were among the most difficult of my life, though not in the way I had expected. I had anticipated grief for the relationship, and there was grief, but it was complicated by the simultaneous process of rediscovering who I was without Victoria's constant influence. It was like emerging from a long illness into a world that had continued without me, finding that my muscles had atrophied and my reflexes had dulled, and my sense of self had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. I had to relearn how to make decisions without calculating their impact on Victoria's mood, how to express opinions without fear of correction, how to exist in space without monitoring for signs of displeasure. I reached out to friends I had neglected, explaining as much as I could of what had happened, accepting their support with a vulnerability that felt new and uncomfortable. Marcus and Alina welcomed me back without judgment, offering their guest room when I could not bear to be alone with my thoughts, sitting with me through long evenings of painful processing. I started therapy, finding a counselor who specialized in recovery from narcissistic abuse and who helped me name what I had experienced, understand its dynamics, and begin the work of healing. I learned terms like love bombing, gaslighting, trauma bonding, and narcissistic supply, each concept providing a frame for experiences that had seemed inexplicable while I was living through them. Understanding the pattern did not erase its effects, but it did make them less mystifying, less evidence of my own failures, and more consequence of deliberate manipulation. The recovery process was not linear, and there were setbacks along the way. I encountered triggers I did not expect, moments when a particular phrase or situation would send me spiraling back into the anxiety and self-doubt that had characterized my time with Victoria. I struggled with trust in new relationships, oscillating between hypervigilance for warning signs and the fear that my judgment was too damaged to be reliable. I carried shame about having been so thoroughly manipulated, embarrassment at my failure to recognize what now seemed so obvious, grief for the time and energy and self I had lost to someone who had never truly seen me. But I also discovered reserves of strength I had not known I possessed, capacities for growth and change that the relationship had temporarily obscured. I rebuilt my career, re-established my friendships, reconnected with family, and slowly, painfully, reconstructed a sense of self that belonged to me alone. I learned to recognize the red flags I had ignored on my birthday night. The too intense attention, the rapid intimacy, the subtle criticisms disguised as jokes, the isolation from friends, the jealousy framed as devotion, the cycle of idealization and devaluation. I developed boundaries I had never before thought necessary, skills for protecting myself that I had never before needed. The experience of loving a narcissist changed me permanently, but not entirely for the worse. I emerged from the wreckage with a deeper understanding of relationship dynamics, a stronger connection to my own needs and feelings, and a commitment to authentic connection that had been forged in the crucible of its opposite. Years have passed since that birthday night when I first saw Victoria across a crowded restaurant, and I can finally look back at the experience with something like gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain, which was real and lasting, but gratitude for the lessons learned and the person I became in recovery. I know now that love should not feel like walking on eggshells, that partners should amplify rather than diminish each other, that the intensity that seemed so romantic at the beginning was actually a warning sign of dysfunction to come. I know the 6 signs I ignored: the love bombing that created artificial intimacy, the subtle devaluation that eroded my self-esteem, the isolation that cut me off from support, the jealousy that controlled my behavior, the cycle of idealization and punishment that kept me bonded through intermittent reinforcement, and the identity erosion that nearly cost me myself. I share this story not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the possibility of recovery, evidence that even the most thoroughly manipulated among us can find our way back to wholeness. The woman I fell in love with on my birthday was never real. She was a performance designed to capture my attention and secure my devotion. The relationship I thought I had was never a partnership, but a power dynamic in which I played a predetermined role. Understanding this does not erase the feelings I had, the genuine love I offered to someone incapable of receiving it, but it does allow me to hold that love with compassion rather than shame. I loved fully and authentically. That my love was exploited reflects on my abuser, not on me. And now, finally, I am free to love again, this time with wisdom hard-won through suffering.